number 10, vampire killings. So starting us off, we have the supposed vampire killings from the 1800s. Now, spoiler alert here, they weren't actually vampires. Well, I guess I don't know that for sure, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and say they weren't. Anyways, back in the 1800s, people in New England believed that cadavers were rising from their graves at night and preying on the living. So to solve this problem, they began exhuming the cadavers. Now, some kept it simple and just turned the cadaver face down, but others jumped to more extreme methods like ripping the bones apart and rearranging them, or burning the deceased person's heart and inhaling the smoke. Apparently at the time, it was believed inhaling the smoke cured tuberculosis, though I can only imagine it made matters much worse for them. Some towns were so into the ritual that they would even hold festivals during the process and celebrate the exhumation and subsequent destruction of the corpses all together. So while it was incredibly unsettling, they did truly believe they were vampires haunting them in the night, so I guess it gave them some peace of mind. Next up at number 9, dentures. While today dentures are made from composite resin or sometimes porcelain, during the 18th and 19th centuries, of course, those materials weren't available. But as you can imagine, people were still losing teeth at an even higher rate due to the high sugar diet, attempted teeth whitening, which was really just wearing away their enamel instead of brightening it, and the overall lack of knowledge around hygiene. So dentures were still needed and wanted by many. So what was their material of choice? Well, for the easiest and most profitable route, many would acquire the teeth from dead bodies. Although if you had some money, you might be able to afford dentures made from ivory. Other materials were sometimes the teeth of animals or wood, but honestly, I think we can all agree that none of those sound like terribly sanitary options, considering professional physicians at the time weren't sterilizing instruments and some didn't even believe in disinfecting prior to surgery. Next up at number 8, stained glass. If you walk into just about any old church, you'll notice the walls are decorated with beautiful stained glass. But what might surprise you is that in some of the particularly older pieces, there is a strange ingredient that helps it all come together. In 1112, a German monk wrote about the process of creating the beautifully colored glass, and as he detailed, it starts off, innocently enough, adding sand and potash at a high temp until it becomes molten. From there, they'd add a stabilizer before coloring the glass with different metallic oxides like copper, cobalt, and gold. But once the glass was cooled and shaped, the small details were added by paint. They made the paint usually from lead or copper and would then suspend it in urine. So quite literally, some of those old stained glass windows were painted with pea paint, which I mean kind of just makes me giggle if I'm honest, but it is definitely a weird ingredient to think about being in paint. Coming in at number 7, leather-bound books. Nowadays, it's unusual to even find real leather on anything, but once upon a time, the leather on books wasn't even from cows. It was from people. Called anthropodermic bibliopegi, the books were made in a similar way as they would now, but obviously with one huge difference. They used human skin instead of an animal. While there are actually only 18 confirmed books of its kind that still exist, we have no idea just how many there could have been all those years ago. Allegedly, the books were usually made from executed convicts, and during the French Revolution, there were rumors that a tannery for human skin was established outside of Paris. I mean, it kind of gives me the willies to think about it, and I'm just glad we've moved on to a different material to bind our books today. Next up at number 6, Minnie Dean. Wilhelmina Dean, or Minnie as she was often referred to, was a nanny in New Zealand during 1880 and was a well-known caretaker in her town. But something was off with the woman, and soon she began having quite the dark spot on her name and career. In 1889, one of the young people under her care suddenly died, as if out of nowhere, and initially it was viewed as a freak accident, but 2 years later the same thing happened again. Now, with 2 minors perished under her care, police decided to investigate further into the matter. After a bit of sleuthing, it was concluded that under Minnie's care, the 2 minors were as she was attempting to take out life insurance on them. Police immediately took the remaining young boy in her care, finding it in dirty clothes and drinking curdled milk. By 1895, the investigation into her crimes continued, and she was spotted trying to flee on a train with another victim in her arms. And when police searched her house, they found 3 more covered up victims. Eventually found guilty for all her crimes, she was the first and only woman ever hanged in New Zealand. Next up at number 5, radiation test subject. In 1999, a man named Hisashi Uchi was a power plant technician, and he became known for being exposed to the highest amount of radiation of any human in history. While working at the Tokamura nuclear power plant, after a lack of safety protocols, improper training, and just an overall pressure to meet deadlines, Uchi and his coworkers made a terrible error. They mistakenly mixed an incorrect measurement of radioactive materials into the wrong tank, and as you've probably figured out, it caused a near fatal burst of gamma rays. Hisashi, who happened to be the closest to the incident, was brutally injured and sent to the hospital. Once he was there, it was discovered he had no more white blood cells, so essentially meaning that he had no remaining immune system. And despite being in intense pain with a rapidly deteriorating condition, doctors kept him alive under the family's request. So for 83 days, Uchi remained alive, being used as a test subject for experimental radiation treatment by the doctors, which, I mean, in their defense was the request of the family, but still, he endured several cardiac arrests, lost all of his skin, and suffered brain damage as well as organ failure. One of the last things Uchi ever said was, quote, "I can't take it anymore, I'm not a guinea pig." And then finally, one more cardiac arrest released him from his torture. Coming in at number 4, mumia. Most widely practiced between the 12th to the 17th century, although there were a few cases in the 18th century that pop up, mumia was widely used as a means of medicine in many European countries. Now, if you can't tell by the name, mumia is creepily just as it sounds, the use of human remains to fix a living person's ailments. It was believed by many of the top physicians at the time that ingesting certain remains prompted the medicinal power of the mummy and could cure things like coagulated blood, pain, coughs, inflammation, cramps, and even heal open wounds. Now, they didn't just sit around eating the carcass directly. Instead, they would either grind the bones into a powder and drink it from there, or drink an extracted liquid from the embalmed individual. In fact, it was so popular at one point that it's believed the reason there are so few mummies these days is because of the high demand of flesh at the time. Coming in at number 3, James Jameson. One of the heirs to the Jameson whiskey family fortune, Jameson considered himself to be an adventurer of sorts and often traveled to far-off lands, detailing the trips in his diary. In 1888, Jameson decided to head out to explore the Congo, and while there he wrote about and demanded some gruesome things from the locals. So before beginning this expedition, Jameson discovered that the area he was visiting was known to have a population that participated in the eating of other humans. Apparently, Jameson set out to witness it firsthand, which, I mean, why was that his dream? A little suspicious if you ask me, but I digress. According to Asad Farhan, who was his translator for the trip, Jameson bought a girl from a trader of slaves for a few handkerchiefs and gave her over to the tribe to be. Allegedly, he didn't pay the tribe directly, but in a roundabout way, he did sort of pay to have this girl. What's even more gross is that he proceeded to draw and paint watercolors of the gruesome event while it happened, which again, just wrong on so many levels. Coming in at number 2, Cambodian Barbies. You may have been taught about the Khmer Rouge in history class, but if they don't ring a bell, essentially they were an extreme communist regime in Cambodia that held government between 1975 to 1979. They were known for being extremely cruel and committed some of the most horrifying acts of genocide in history, with nearly 2 million perishing under their ruling. Now, during their radical rule, the entire country was isolated from all foreign influences. This included closing schools, hospitals, factories, banks, for an agriculture. They believed this would stimulate the rebirth of the country, but of course, all it did was send it into desolate famine and poverty. Led by a man named Pol Pot, the people of the country could not forage for food, despite the fact that everyone was starving, and anyone who disobeyed the orders was killed. Apparently, as the people became more and more desperate, they began to turn to folk magic, turning Barbie dolls into smoking talismans for luck. Thankfully, since its dissolution in 1999, all the leaders have been jailed for their atrocities, and the people are freed from the genocidal regime. And last up, in our number 1 spot, the Rabbit Woman. Her name was Mary Toft, and in 1726 she became known throughout Surrey, England as having been the woman who gave birth to rabbits. Now, I know what you're thinking, that isn't possible. And you would be right, but still the story of how she convinced people it was real was crazy. Apparently Toft was actually pregnant at one point, but miscarried, and it could have been this that sent her into her madness. Toft began declaring that she was giving birth to various animal parts, and so her local doctor became involved in the case. At first, everyone actually believed her, as in fact a rabbit did, well, come out of her. And with a doctor backing up her claims, the king and his royal surgeon got involved. Unlike her local doctor, the king's surgeon was skeptical, and after discovering corn inside the stomach of one of the rabbits and hay in their droppings, it proved the animal hadn't developed inside Mary. Eventually, Mary Toft admitted to the hoax and explained that she had manually inserted the animals inside her to make the delivery as realistic as possible. She was immediately imprisoned for fraud, and the medical community was ridiculed for having been fooled. Starting us off at number 10, we have mummy unwrapping parties. So we already know that people love to do all kinds of weird and strange things with mummies back in the day, but after people widely stopped eating them or using their remains to make medicines, a new mummy trend began. After Napoleon's first expedition to Egypt in 1798, Europeans began to become even more enthralled with mummies than they ever had been. In the 19th century, a mummy craze began. Travelers began bringing back whole mummies they had bought off the street in Egypt, and the next thing you know, they were no longer thought of having medicinal purposes, but rather being a wonderful party activity. Soon it became customary to hold mummy unwrapping parties, and wealthy Victorians would gather around as the host slowly unwrapped the dead body, showing off his wealth while simultaneously giving guests a thrilling evening filled with horror and delight. I have no clue what was done with the mummies after the public unboxing, but somehow I almost think it's better, as I'm sure whatever happened next was even more disgusting. Number 9. Bomb shadows. We all likely know and were taught about the devastating bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that killed 226,000 people in 1945. But one thing that you may not have learned about was what those bombs left behind. Apparently, as the attack was happening, the light and heat from the weapon was absorbed by the people and the objects in front of it. The surrounding light and heat then ended up bleaching the areas of the ground where nothing had been, leaving objects and people-shaped marks on the pavement. They became known as the shadows of the dead, and even now, after nearly 80 years, some of the shadows remain stained into the pavement and walls all over the city, as a reminder to the human capacity for destruction. Coming in at number 8, Vlad the Impaler. Born into a royal family in 1431, Vlad III was son of Vlad Dracul, the ruler of Wallachia at the time. During this time, Transylvania faced a lot of battles and bloodshed as the Ottoman Empire kept trying to push west towards Europe, and the Christian Crusaders marched eastward towards the Holy Land. In 1442, Vlad Dracul was called to a diplomatic meeting with the Ottomans and brought with him his sons. But the meeting was a trap, and all three were arrested and held hostage. The father was granted to leave as long as he left his sons behind, and he agreed. So for the next few years, Vlad and his brother were trapped and tortured, although they did also strangely tutor the men in science, philosophy, and art, as well as turn them into warriors. Eventually his brother and father both died, and Vlad was released. Soon after, he became the leader of Wallachia, and when the city of Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, Vlad led the force to defend his land from an invasion. It was during this time he became known as Vlad the Impaler, as he often used metal or wooden poles to impale invaders right through their chest, or sometimes he would even insert it vertically up the victim until it pierced through their shoulders, neck, or mouth. While well respected, he became notorious for killing thousands of people, and eventually became the inspiration for Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Count Dracula. Coming in at number 7, incubators. Nowadays, incubators are seen as life-saving devices for premature newborns, but shockingly, this was not always the attitude towards them. During the early 20th century, most physicians kind of held the belief that premature infants were not meant to survive, and so they were tragically just kind of left to die in most cases. But Martin Cooney held a different belief from his peers and wanted to try and change the narrative. But in order to do so, he had to make it a spectacle. One thing that people loved to do back in the day was gawk at the unusual, laugh at the different, and it's for that very reason that sideshows existed. So in order to save the lives of the preemies, Cooney decided to display them in what he called hatcheries as a sideshow in Coney Island. For a quarter, visitors could gaze upon the peculiar and small young people, and over the years he managed to save more than 6,500 lives by packaging up their safety in a swallowable pill for the times he lived in. After so much success, doctors started coming around his ideas, and now they are used by hospitals around the world. Next up at number 6, Pharaoh Pepi. Although the exact timeline is up for debate, somewhere around 2278 BC to 2216 BC, Pharaoh Pepi II reigned in Egypt. The ruler succeeded the throne at age 6 and became widely known as being one of Egypt's most demanding kings, which comes with little to no surprise that a literal first grader being given the power of a pharaoh affected his ego in a negative way. Often he demanded outlandish tasks of his slaves and subjects, but most strange of all was his practice to keep flies off of him. Apparently he hated flies more than anything in the world, so Pepi would force several slaves a day to be covered head to toe in honey and then stand naked by him in hopes to attract the bugs towards them and off himself. By the end of their days, his slaves would be covered in bites, boils, and sores caused by the countless insects that swarmed to them, and soon they would often succumb to diseases like malaria. Later on, flies actually became more or less a creature of high esteem for the Egyptians, becoming a symbol for persistence and tenacity, but for the near 90-year or so reign under Pepi, they were apparently the worst creature alive. Coming in at number 5, a cat phone. In 1929, a pair of scientists at Princeton University had a question. They wanted to test out how the auditory nerve perceives sound. But in order to test that, they had to find a subject. Now, as you can imagine, not too many people were lining up for this, so they ultimately decided to perform the experiment on a cat. The cat was heavily sedated prior to the operation, where the scientists cut out parts of its brain before attaching one end of a telephone wire into its auditory nerve and the other end into a receiver. Shockingly, the cat survived the operation, and the scientists went forward with their experiment. To their delight, they discovered that if you spoke into the cat's ear, you could hear it perfectly through the receiver. But their initial success was not enough for them. Next, they had to know if it worked once the cat was dead. So they killed the cat to test their theory, but sadly the cat phone no longer functioned without access to a functional brain. Despite its rather gruesome story, the two did actually contribute to a valuable understanding of the brain and helped future researchers in development of cochlear implants. So at least it wasn't all in vain. Coming in at number 4, death photography. Memento mori means remember you must die. For centuries, trinkets were used to keep the thought of death close and to help the living through their grieving process. In Victorian times, this looked like lockets filled with hair of the dead, a mask of your loved one created out of wax, or by having paintings and sculptures made in their memory. But all of a sudden, a new invention came along that led to creating an all-new kind of memento mori, the photograph. As its popularity increased, the price of having your photo taken was all of a sudden cheaper than a portrait, and many began using this new technology to keep the essence of their loved ones preserved forever. Next thing you know, families are getting photos taken with their dead family members, and for many, it was even the first time getting a photo taken. The dead were sometimes propped up to look alive, while other times eyeballs were painted on after it developed to give them a more lifelike look. The pictures would be hung in the house just like any normal family portrait and served as a reminder to the family of the ones they lost. Thankfully, the practice went out of style as healthcare began to improve and less people were dying so young. Coming in at number 3, gibbeting. During medieval times, the practice of execution was really just an average Tuesday afternoon, and even darker was that it was pretty common practice for criminals to be left on the gallows after they were hanged, as sort of a warning sign to the others in the town. But another form of torturous death they made criminals endure was called gibbeting. The ancient practice consisted of humiliating and hanging a criminal from a large post, but unlike being hanged, the convict was stuffed inside a small cage that was left dangling in the air. The victim would be put in the cage completely alive and essentially left to rot, while people of the town gathered round to witness the spectacle, often even torturing the criminal in their own ways. Eventually, after starvation, cold, and muscle atrophy, they would die and their rotting bodies would be left inside the hanging cage for weeks, sometimes even years, until nothing but their skeletons remained inside. Eventually, the practice was outlawed by the mid-1800s, but some say that if you walk past an old gibbeting cage, you can still hear the screams of the soul who died inside. Coming in at number 2, chats with a severed head. In the early 1900s, a French physician named Gabriel Boudieu was interested in exploring the connection between mind, brain, and body. So in 1905, when the execution of Henri Langouis was announced, he rushed to the guillotine to study the aftermath. Boudieu claimed that after the guillotine dropped and the head fell to the ground, he called out to the victim and the severed head allegedly blinked his eyes as if awakening. He wrote, "The eyelids lifted up, this time I swear, in a distinctly normal movement, slow as if awakening or torn from thought." He further detailed that the pupils focused in on him until slowly the eyelids faded closed. But once again, he called the man's name and his eyes opened. Some believe that it was simply leftover nerve impulses, but Gabriel swore that the head could hear him and understand him. He said he felt something looking into his eyes and knew it wasn't just a coincidence. And last up today, the Leningrad famine. For 872 days, the people of Leningrad suffered one of the most destructive military blockades in history. In just a little less than 3 years, the population dropped from 2.5 million to just 800,000. In September of 1941, they were bombarded by the Axis powers and cut off from the outside world, receiving no wood, no gas, no coal, and no food. And it only got worse once winter hit. Soon they were trying to stay alive with no food in negative 40-degree temperatures, and so many resorted to burning their possessions just to evade death one more day. But as time went on, it only got darker and darker. People would leave their homes and never return. At first, many assumed they died in the cold, but suddenly it was happening more and more frequently. It didn't take too long to draw a connection to the mysterious disappearances, as the next day there would magically be meat available at the market, usually labeled as horse or dog. Soon after, people began killing firsthand, just to feed themselves, and some were even driven to kill their own families just to survive. Officially, there are 2,000 recorded cases of eating human flesh, but it's believed to be much higher. All the while, of course, the elite hoarded food that came into the city via the lakes and never once went hungry. There are journal recordings from the same time about eating goose and caviar at a party while the commoners froze to death in the streets. Starting us off at number 10 is divorce. Well, today you can pretty much get a divorce for, well, really any reason you want. That wasn't always the case. In fact, prior to being able to file over irreconcilable differences like most couples do now, pretty much only men were allowed to divorce their wives, not the other way around. Unless, that is, the wife could prove her husband's impotence, as it was seen as a woman's legal duty to bestow a child to her husband. If he couldn't give her the goods per se, she could file for an annulment of the marriage. But how did the court go about proving this, you ask? Well, of course they couldn't just take the woman's word for it, so they would bring in a witness, usually a sex worker, to try and arouse the man. That, or the court would enter your marital bedroom and, well, you know, see for themselves just how well the man could get the job done. If he did in fact have any issues completing his manly duties, the woman could be freed of the marriage. Just be careful they don't accuse you of becoming a witch. Next up at number 9 is man-made fertilizer. The Battle of Waterloo in 1815 resulted in the death of an estimated 60,000 soldiers, but not many of these bones have ever been recovered, and the reason why is pretty grim. In a strange, twisted series of events, the English decided to clear the field of the corpses and put the bones to use in a rather effective, but albeit creepy way. Newspapers of the time reported that the fallen French army were ground up in Yorkshire factories and the bone dust was added to their manure. Apparently the oil from the marrow proved especially helpful in the grave robbing turned fertilizer plan, and the fertilizer was purchased by farmers across England and scattered widely to help grow their crops, meaning that an entire generation of England ate food made possible with the help of dead French soldiers. Coming in at number 8 is Qing Shi Huang. Before the understanding of modern science, there was a lot of ideas about elixirs and remedies that have quite literally no logic to back them up. Now, of course, it wasn't their fault. They truthfully didn't know any better. But looking back, that doesn't make it any less wild. The first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, was one of the many intent on finding the elixir of immortality, and so he demanded his royal doctors find this magical potion for him, otherwise he would have them killed. I mean, just real low stakes stuff. Eventually, likely under the duress of not wanting to be killed and also probably not knowing what they were doing, they offered him a magic potion that they promised would bring him eternal life. The magic potion, however, was actually just mercury, and the emperor ended up dying from poisoning himself. A bit ironic that in the pursuit of eternal life, he actually only made his life shorter. Coming in at number 7 is Henry Rathbone. During school, we all learn about John Wilkes Booth, who assassinated President Lincoln at the Ford's Theater in Washington. But did you know that that wasn't the only tragedy to occur due to that night's events? In the theater with Lincoln that night was his wife, along with Henry Rathbone, a military officer, and his girlfriend Clara. At the time of the assassination, Rathbone saw Booth and tried to save Lincoln, but Booth stabbed him before he could reach the president. Although he physically survived the attack, he left with a deep-seated guilt about not being able to save the president's life. 2 years went by, and despite trying to move on from the tragedy by marrying Clara and starting a family, his mind never fully recovered and he became more and more paranoid about the world around him. He began claiming to hear voices speak to him from behind the walls that would taunt him endlessly, until eventually they pushed him towards complete breakdown. Convinced it was the only option, Rathbone shot and killed his wife before stabbing himself in an attempt to take his own. But just like before, he survived the attack on himself. Eventually he was tried for killing his wife and sent to live the rest of his life in an asylum. Coming in at number 6 is an animal trial. So not only did they have trials over the impotence of a man, believe it or not, you could also take a literal animal to court in the Middle Ages. I kid you not. The whole kit and caboodle would be present. A judge, prosecutor, witnesses, a defense attorney. They truly took it very seriously. The reasoning behind it all, I suppose, was that at the time, law prohibited punishment without trial for everything and everyone. The first recorded instance was the prosecution of a pig in France in 1266, accused of eating a young boy. The pig was found guilty for his crime and executed as punishment. If that doesn't sound crazy enough, keep in mind the judge would hold the behavior of the accused animal against it, and if the court didn't feel the animal was acting properly, that was taken into account. These trials were only put on against domestic animals, as they truly believed, having been in the company of humans, they should know how to act. correct. Now, not all animals were executed for their crimes. Some lesser criminals were merely excommunicated from the church or cursed and sent to live in the wild, but it's still crazy. I mean, honestly, I wish I was making this up. Coming in at number 5 is John Scott Harrison. Raised by the 9th President of the US, William Henry, and the father of the 23rd President, Benjamin Harrison, although John Scott himself never rose to presidential ranks, he did serve 2 years in Congress and was a prominent political figure in his time. But one day he decided politics wasn't really for him anymore and spent his last 20 years managing a farm in Ohio. After his death in 1878, his family gathered for the service and took great pains to protect his grave. At the time, grave robbing was at an all-time peak due to the demand for cadavers in medical schools. To avoid having his father be another subject of this, Benjamin had an unusually deep grave made and placed a massive stone that required 16 men to move placed on top of his casket. For extra measure, he then covered the whole ordeal in cement, then placed small wooden pegs below the surface of the covering so that he could tell if it had been disturbed. Oh, and he hired a security guard to watch it day and night for the next 30 days. After noticing a nearby family friend's grave had been exhumed, Benjamin and his nephew went to go and track it down. They managed to obtain a warrant for the Medical College of Ohio and with the help of a detective went to retrieve the corpse of their dear friend. When they arrived, they found a dissecting room on the top floor, but to their surprise they couldn't find who they were looking for. Instead, they happened upon a body that looked strangely familiar, and when they removed the rags covering the head, they were horrified to discover it was the corpse of one Mr. John Scott Harrison. How the grave robber managed, we will never know. Next up at number 4 is Locusta. The Pax Romana is known for being one of the most peaceful times in history. The Romans had pretty much conquered what they set out to, and so they began to, just chill out for a bit. Then along came Locusta, esteemed maker of poisons and the world's first serial killer. Well, more like a hired assassin by the Roman Empire. Locusta was routinely caught poisoning people and despite frequent arrests for her killings, was always let free. Why is that? Well, the Empire got word and decided they could use her to their advantage. Her first big gig came from Empress Agrippina to kill her husband, Emperor Claudius. Locusta complied with glee and assassinated the emperor. However, soon after, Agrippina threw her under the bus for the crime. But now, under the ruling of Lord Nero, he saved her for his own devilish plots. For the next 15 years under Nero, she worked consistently and was even awarded for her service. Locusta received a villa and even a small staff to help her in her poisonous endeavors. Nero even went as far to provide her with her own school for the profession. But after Nero was sentenced to death, Locusta lost her security blanket and lawful immunity and was executed by the emperor for her crimes. Coming in at number 3 is Gilles de Rais. Joan of Arc is rightfully so credited as a certified badass and patron saint who was a major defender of the French during the 100 Years' War. Among her most supportive and trusted allies was Gilles de Rais, an esteemed knight in the French army who was appointed the highest military distinction one could receive at the time. But if he was such a big deal and close companion of Joan, why isn't he as widely celebrated? Well, that's because sadly he was actually super evil. By day he was defending France beside Joan of Arc, but at night he was into the senseless killing of minors in occultist rituals. Often he would lure the unsuspecting victims in with psychological torture, convincing them that it was just a game, before bludgeoning them and doing other cruel and unspeakable things to their corpses, supposedly using them for his rituals. Eventually, he was found out and tried for his crimes, admitting to all his vicious acts and hanged as punishment. Although no one knows for sure, it's suspected he had nearly 150 victims. Coming in at number 2 is virginity tests. Back in a time when a woman was merely the property of her husband, there was one very important thing that needed to be assured before the wedding night: that she was pure. Mostly because it was believed that the consummation in fact kind of sealed the whole husband owning his wife deal, and if she had done it with anyone else, she didn't really belong to him. Which Charming. So to ensure that their potential wife was worth the dowry, suitors would perform virginity tests on their brides to make sure they weren't getting a second-hand woman, if you will. Such tests included inspecting their urine, as it was believed a virgin's urine would be clear. Other times they would give the woman a special potion, and if she could refrain from peeing, she was a virgin, as if a bladder was any indication of that. Sometimes a physician would be hired to inspect the woman's downstairs area, as they believed they could literally just tell by looking at it. Most common though was to inspect the sheets after the marriage was consummated. If there was blood, hooray, a virgin. If not, well then it was assumed she was a liar and her husband was legally entitled to compensation for being swindled into marrying her. And last up today are syphilis zombies. Sometimes it's easy to forget just how much antibiotics have changed the world around us. While nowadays a shot of penicillin can keep an early onset of the STI at bay, back in the day it could quite literally be the end of you. In fact, in 1494, Italy experienced one of the worst outbreaks in history, and if you didn't know any better, you might have thought it was a zombie apocalypse. Of course, before there was any kind of real understanding about how these types of diseases could be spread or caught, people were, let's just say, having a lot of fun with each other. But on the flip side of that, if they caught the infection, it would cause flesh to literally dissolve off their bodies until their inevitable death within a few months. It was also widely believed that bedding a virgin could cure you of the disease, so that's fun. Apparently, it was not uncommon to witness people missing hands, feet, eyes, noses, or look as if they'd been dropped into a vat of acid while walking down the street. Also remember that it took a few months before the disease actually killed them, so they were just living in excruciating pain while their flesh was slowly eaten away, in some cases right down to the bone. With that image in mind, it does make a little bit more sense as to why they believed you would go to hell for premarital relations. Like, I kind of get why they thought it was the devil punishing you for your sins. Thank God for antibiotics. Starting us off at number 10 is the Judas cradle. The medieval times are known for a lot of stuff, and one of those is their insanely gruesome torture devices. Back then, if you'd found out you were facing the guillotine, you could actually breathe a sigh of relief, because trust me, there were far worse ways to die. One of these horrific devices was called a Judas cradle, and was used to interrogate prospective criminals into talking, and often would result in their death one way or another. Victims that faced this torture would be stripped of their clothing, bound, and then lowered slowly onto a pyramid-shaped spike that, depending on your downstairs parts, would be aimed at different areas, I'll just say. Any movement at all would only make the pain worse, so if you weren't telling them what they wanted to hear, they would often rock the victim back and forth, tearing them further open, and they would keep victims here as long as it took, sometimes even overnight. But what about the death part? Well, if you didn't die from injuries received during the torture, or frankly just blood loss, then most died from infection. You see, the spike was never really cleaned, so there was a whole horde of bacteria and disease that would settle onto the spike, inevitably seeping into the victim's nether regions. How fun, right? Next up at number 9 is cruentation. The Middle Ages had many interesting ways to handle justice, much of which I think we are all incredibly grateful is illegal nowadays. One of these such practices was called cruentation. Essentially, back then they believed that corpses retained a tiny spark of life after death, and so they were therefore revered as magical entities. Just imagining that they saw rigor mortis and decided that the corpse was somehow still alive. But how did this involve their judicial system? Well, with the idea of using the corpse's magical powers to their advantage, they would place an accused killer in contact with the corpse of their alleged victim. And if the corpse started spontaneously bleeding when the convict was in its presence, it was seen as confirmed evidence that they were guilty of the crime. This actually remained a completely legal practice until the late 17th century, but thankfully somewhere down the line they figured out that maybe a dead bleeding body couldn't be used as proof to convict someone of killing. Next up at number 8 is slug soup. Listen, I love just about all the creatures on the planet, and I don't have it out for slugs or anything, but I have never been able to look at one without feeling nauseous, so this actually sounds like a personal version of hell to me. During the Crusade battles, Muslims became popular for using aconite to poison the Crusaders. This was obviously causing quite an issue, as at the time there was no known cure. That was until one day when 14th century doctor Guido de Vigevano noticed some slugs munching away on an aconite leaf, and he had the biggest light bulb moment of his career. He collected slugs and boiled them before using the boiled sludge and turning it into a soup. First he tested it on animals, and after successful results there, he decided to try it out for himself. After a bit of trial and error, it turned out to make quite a successful antidote to the poison. But man, oh man, does it sound incredibly disgusting. But still, better than being poisoned, I guess. Coming in at number 7 are Transi Tombs. In the Middle Ages, the practice of memento mori, meaning remember you must die, was huge. Memento mori was practiced in many ways: open caskets, churches filled with skeletons of the dead, and years later developed into things like photographing the dead. Their keen attachment to this philosophy likely stemmed from the sheer amount of people dying so frequently due to the overall lack of hygiene, so they had to come to terms with death in a much more peaceful sense than maybe we do now. One of their favorite ways to practice memento mori, however, was with Transi Tombs, which were funerary monuments that depicted the deceased in a stage of eerie decomposition. As you can imagine, they were costly, so usually they could only be resurrected after those with high standing or a small fortune in the bank. At the time, there was an existing belief that the earthly body was merely a transition vessel of the soul, and that after death the spirit would be resurrected. And so in creating these tombs that resembled the decomposing dead, they figured it would help the soul move on more quickly. And while I'm not opposed to all of the reasons behind it, from the modern lens, it is a bit morbid to have statues not only resembling the dead, but looking like zombies lining the streets, and I'm just glad this practice went out of fashion. Coming in at number 6 is bloodletting. Back in the day, the medical practice of bloodletting was used by medieval physicians as they believed it would literally let the bad blood out of the body. This belief is mostly derived from the Greek physician Hippocrates and his theory of the 4 humors. The 4 humoral theory centered around the belief that inside the body there are 4 main humors or liquids: black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm, and that any imbalance in these liquids was what caused health issues or even changes in temperament. So where bloodletting came in was that there was this belief you could let out blood in order to balance out these liquids in your body again. Now, while this theory was definitely a stepping stone in modern medicine, many argue could be considered a precursor to blood transfusions, the way that it was being done was without any real scientific backing, and without any understanding of just how much blood was safe to let out or from what vein or artery was the safest. For example, people were so into the practice at the time that they would base which day was best for bloodletting on texts, usually advising to pick a saint's day. It was also popular to rely on charts showing which parts of the body were best to bleed from according to their zodiac. So as you can imagine, the practice did not always end well. Coming in at number 5 is Saint Francesca Romana. During medieval times, fornication in any other context than between a man and his wife and for the purposes of procreation was considered a sin, punishable by life in prison. Now, of course, there were many people that did not take this to heart, but there was one woman who very much did: Francesca Romana. For as long as Romana could recall, she always wanted to become a nun when she got older, but as happened all too frequently back then, her father forced her into marriage at the age of 13 as the man in question was extremely wealthy. At first she was incredibly reluctant, but after she allegedly received a vision from Saint Alexis, she changed her tune and became a dutiful wife, and even perhaps grew to like her husband. But this didn't change Romana's belief about the sins revolving what went on in the marital bed, so in private, wishing to remain spiritually chaste even if she couldn't be in her physical body, she would heat pork fat and burn her nether regions to ensure that she would remain in extreme pain throughout the act and never enjoy a minute of it. This was the only way she believed she could commit the act without sin and remain in the good graces with God. Coming in at number 4 is an arthritis cure. This one actually blew my mind when I first came across it. According to an 1896 news story in the Smithsonian, one day a drunk man was on a beach with some of his friends when he spotted a rotting whale carcass. Because he was drunk, he thought it'd be super funny to dive right into it. And he did. His friends waited for him and finally he came out, but he reported something incredibly strange. That his rheumatoid arthritis was seemingly gone. This sparked a national craze in Australia, and once word got out about the healing powers of the whale carcass, the town of Eden became a worldwide destination for people suffering from the condition. Visitors would be lowered into a freshly dead whale through a hole which would be sewn up, and it was advertised that if the person could stay inside for 20 to 30 hours, they would be cured of their pain. I have to imagine that you would need to be in so much pain to give this a try in the first place, because the thought of spending an entire day inside of a dead whale just seems wild. That being said, it's not all a bunch of hogwash. There is reason to believe that the rotting whale would have acted like a sweat box of sorts, potentially relieving some of the pain, but truthfully I don't see how this could cause any kind of permanent fix. Let's just be grateful there are some other options out there today. Coming in at number 3 is a brutal execution. As has already been established, one of medieval Europe's most notorious strengths was figuring out the most gruesome way to either torture or kill their citizens. And if you thought that the Judas cradle was bad, then wait until you hear about this one. To be hanged, drawn, and quartered was a method of execution far worse than any other. At least with practices like the guillotine, it's over quickly enough, but with this one it was quite literally drawn out just to make you suffer. First off, the victim would be tied to a wooden panel and dragged, or drawn, behind a horse to their place of execution. Second, they would be hanged until the point right before they died. Then they would mutilate the body, often by disembowelment or emasculating it, while they were still alive before finally beheading them and quartering the body, meaning cutting it into 4 pieces. It was intentionally excessive, as this was a punishment saved for those who committed high treason against the king, and was used to instill compliance and fear in the onlookers. It was most popular in 14th century England, although it remained in the rotation of choices until it was abolished in 1870. Coming in at number 2 are changelings. Across Europe there was an old belief in changelings, which were thought to be evil creatures left in place of young ones stolen by fairies. This was a huge problem for many reasons. Number 1, it was objectively not happening. You see, the main reason that parents believed their little ones had been swapped with a changeling was that their young ones suddenly fell ill, had physical deformities, behavioral changes like advanced knowledge beyond their years, or being mischievous. So essentially, if the young person in question got sick, became intelligent, had a disability, or acted like a normal developing person in any way, it was viewed as a changeling. Tragically, once it was believed that a changeling imposter was in their arms, there was only one way to handle the situation: hurt it in hopes that the fairies would come save the changeling and they would give their real one back. They did things like exorcisms, leaving them in the cold, poisoning them, or even trying to end their lives. And they believed that in doing this, their real little one would be returned to them. It may just be one of the saddest and most cruel practices to have ever existed. And last up, in our number 1 spot, are Ivy League photos. If you thought there was corruption in the high-ranking areas of society before this, then buckle up, because this one might be one of the most insane things I've ever heard. Apparently, for some time, it was actually required for students enrolling in Ivy League schools to have their photos taken in a grotesquely inappropriate fashion. To put it delicately, you were not allowed to be dressed. This dark underbelly came to light in the 1970s when a Yale employee opened a long locked room and discovered thousands of photos dating back several decades. It was then uncovered that between the 40s to the 60s, it was a requirement to submit what they called posture photos, which were taken from every single angle and forced the subjects to attach pins to their spines under the guise of studying their spines. Some schools, however, practiced longer. Harvard, for example, began in the 1880s and got away with it until the 20th century. history. Of course, there was a huge investigation about this, and they found that the photos were used in various studies for big tobacco, or that they would use them in books for illustrations, but the creepiest was a professor that admitted the photos were used for anthropological research and were used to study the connection between a student's body type and their intelligence, in what was basically glorified eugenics. Thankfully, most of these photos have since been burned. However, for some reason there are some that remain at the Smithsonian. I'm just grateful the practice of mandatory nude photos is banned, cause actually what the heck is that?